Jujutsu Kaisen just did the unthinkable with chapter 236. Gojo has died at the hands of Sukuna after being sealed away for years in real time, and being the mad lad that he is, Gege Akutami killed off Gojo the exact same week that Gojo got sealed in the anime, and they're passing out papers in real life talking about Gojo being sealed away. To say that Gojo fans are living the meme, all I know is pain, that's an absolute understatement. However, we'll get into the controversy surrounding Gojo's death in a moment, but I do want to start this review off by saying that the opening of the chapter is so bittersweet and heartbreaking as a fan to read, and not just because I'm a fan of Gojo's character, but because we open up with Geto greeting Gojo in the afterlife with a smile on his face, because it goes all the way back to the ending of Jujutsu Kaisen 0, where Gojo calls him his best friend before he kills him, and how the last thing he saw when he was getting sealed away was the body of his best friend, and now the first thing he sees when he seemingly enters the afterlife is the smiling face of his best friend. It's such a bittersweet conclusion for Gojo's character, should this be the case, after what might go down as one of the most intense fights that we have in modern shonen. While the ending might not be what Gojo fans wanted and built up in their head for how he was going to die, the chapters leading up to his death were some of the best action I've read in Weekly Shonen Jump in almost a decade. So with my initial thoughts out of the way, let's back things up and let's dive into a review. So the decision to open up with Gojo surrounded by his friends, in particular starting with Geto, and have it slowly expand from there is something that is very poetic, and the reason is given to us right away at the start. Gojo had previously told his students that when they die, they'll be by themselves in the afterlife, yet we see Gojo surrounded by a bunch of familiar faces, and even more interesting is the fact that it hits home harder when you realize that Gojo, due to being so insanely powerful to a degree that he was alone, yet this shows that all those bonds he formed were formed in spite of him being so much different than everyone else by being so much more insanely powerful than the others in his generation and even the generation behind him. We get to see some closure between Gojo and Geto while also keeping everything focused solely on the two best friends before we expand the roster of the characters in the chapter, which was a smart move from a narrative perspective when you're doing storytelling. Seeing Gojo openly admit that Sukuna was stronger than him, it was a gut punch to read as a fan. It's something that you know to be the case because Sukuna is still alive and Gojo's the one dead, but to actually see him admit it and go so far as to point out that Sukuna wasn't even at full power was something that was jarring to read, but it works due to Gojo's personality still being intact throughout the chapter while also taking steps to humanize the character. We even see a bit of Gojo reflecting on the fight itself, saying that he did his best to give it his all during that fight to reach Sukuna, to make him truly understand that loneliness comes to those who have unrivaled strength, but we get a hint that someone will eventually reach Sukuna, but Gojo stops short of revealing to us as readers who that actually is, and we can see one regret that Gojo has is that while he did have fun with the fight and he left everything on the table, used every technique he knew, used every thought process, all of experience, he wasn't able to force Sukuna to use his full power in that fight, which I'd say might be less of a regret and more of a disappointment that his enemy didn't go full strength using every trick possible to take him down, because Gojo is so used to being the dominant one in a fight, so used to being the apex predator. This time the roles were reversed. Another interesting thing is that you can see the post-fight Gojo is already piecing together in his mind how Sukuna killed him. He might be potentially listening to Sukuna explain everything to him. That's another interpretation, but essentially he's coming to the conclusion that the hits were allowed to actually land so Maharaga could adapt, all while making people believe Maharaga had already adapted to one specific manner, making them think that the adapting was set and unchanging. But even as he walks through the fight in his head, you can still see him come to the conclusion he still would have lost even if Sukuna didn't have Megumi's techniques, which that in itself is very jarring. The line where Geto tells Gojo that he wishes that he was the one that was there with everyone else and giving Gojo a slap on the back before the fight started, it hits hard because you can see it, the irony. Gojo was the strongest and talked about the loneliness that came from being the strongest, yet this chapter in Geto's words proved that he wasn't actually alone. Even if those people are figments of his imagination, they're not actually there, he wasn't actually alone though. It's all about perspective to a degree. However, what's interesting is that Nanami mentions that curses can bring people back to life, the same way that sorcery can. And we have Gojo question for a moment if this is actually the afterlife, going so far as to ask the principal if this was the afterlife, but Gojo says that he hopes this isn't a dream, yet we see a plane in the background that hasn't departed. Now, you can interpret this a few different ways. You can interpret this as the plane hasn't departed, so Gege is teasing the return of Gojo. Annie Twitter's probably going to melt down after this roller coaster of emotions, but you could also interpret this as the plane was waiting for Gojo to arrive to take him off to the afterlife. I personally think he stays dead. It looks like he chose to stay behind with his friends, and it fits with him having so much emphasis on the next generation of Jujutsu sorcerers, basically hinting that their time is coming, their time is here now. One other interesting thing about Gojo being in the afterlife of people surrounding him is the fact that Toji Fushiguro is also shown in the background if you look closely, which is another poetic touch because the one who killed Gojo was Sukuna, but Sukuna was possessing Megami, Toji's son, which is pretty interesting to see how this came full circle in a way. It also pays off the fact that Gojo was thinking about Toji as he was fighting against Sukuna. This also hits home harder when you take the artistic choice of having the flowers shown in the chapter. In particular, flowers blooming. Flowers are something that we look at because they're beautiful. We smell them because they smell good, but they aren't able to fully connect with us on an emotional level, yet we admire them anyway. And the person speaking is, we have Gojo, someone who's admired by those around him in the afterlife. I do think it is worth noting that, again, this afterlife could be interpreted as most likely being Gojo basically having this conversation with himself. None of those people are actually there. It's just Gojo running through his last thoughts and making peace with himself, and we finally get to see a much cleaner glimpse into Gojo's internal struggle and how he thinks others might see him. And this would also mean that he's conceding that whatever he's done and acted before, it was him acting to fulfill his own selfish desires, and if those actions even end up serving a greater purpose is something he's questioning. If this is a send-off for Gojo, I think this did a lot to humanize his character. Now we get to the controversial part here. Gojo being shown with a dead body, upper body slashed in half, separated from his lower body. Basically, Sukuna pulled what we see in all the old samurai movies where we see the damage was done and it takes a minute to unfold. Similar to how when a samurai slices the enemy in, we see the damage afterwards. I don't really agree that this was an off-screen death. We did get the reveal as Sukuna explains it, and we see the black panel where you do see the slash, indicating he was sliced immediately after a hollow purple was shot off, and we see there in the same spot that they were in the last chapter, which kind of lends it to itself, especially when you consider how Sukuna explains it and explains it as cutting space. Sukuna's explanation makes a lot of sense if you take emotions out of it. Maharaga has the ability to adapt to attacks. When faced with the attack for the first time, it doesn't counter right away. Instead, it begins to break down the attack. The more time passes, the better Maharaga can actually comprehend the attack. The more times in a fight that it faces the attack, the quicker the breakdown ultimately becomes. And even after finding the counter, it continues evolving even faster and faster. And that began to open the door for Sukuna figuring out how to actually defeat Gojo. I don't think that this was just Gege killing Gojo off just to kill him, taking out the immense love that fans have for Gojo in this series. This, from a narrative perspective, shouldn't have really come as a shock. As I was reading the last 2 chapters before this one came out, I got the sense that Gojo was going to lose. And in fact, it's something that myself and King Bullet talked about in private, and my buddy King Bullet did a video absolutely predicting that something like this would happen, saying that Gojo was going to lose to Sukuna. The stakes were rising as the fight was going on. At one point, it became a 3 versus 1 battle, which started out as a 1 versus 1 battle where you saw repeat domain expansions being used and 2 characters who were being viewed for most of the series as being unkillable going at it, and exposition told us going into the final attack that Gojo was beginning to realize he could lose. Thinking back to his fight with Toji, that was an omen. And for us as readers, that was our sign that Gojo's probably gonna die. I don't think that this was a meaningless death either. Gojo was built up like someone who was the only one who could go at Sukuna. It's not something that we as fans wanted, Gojo dying. You never like to see your favorite characters die, but this created real stakes in the story. And from a narrative perspective, having Gojo die on the same date as Geto, it actually works. And it's actually very symbolic. Gege did what Horikoshi with My Hero Academia and Tabata with Black Clover, his peers in Weekly Shonen Jump would never actually do, which is pull the trigger on the most popular character in the franchise, and that's exactly how it should be. No character should be safe. Main character or no main character, nobody should be safe if it's for the sake of raising the stakes. Now, as for Sukuna's reason for how he won, again, I don't think it's an ass pull. He basically said that Mahoraga adapted and found a model for how to cut through infinity, and I thought it was a really nice touch artistically to have Yuta being shown restrained by Maki, because you know, based off of the last 2 chapters, that he wanted to go in and help Gojo, and Yuji was telling him to go help Gojo. So those are your 2 dark horses that you have to avenge Gojo's death. We end off with Kashima looking to take a shot at a worn down Sukuna. You can see how the actual battle is about to unfold. They're going to try and take advantage of Gojo actually dying at the hands of Sukuna and build off of whatever damage Gojo was able to do to Sukuna. The other thing that we do have to question is if Gojo did already give Itadori the final finger, and if there's something else long term that Gojo has set up with Itadori that could be brought up back later on in the story itself. My chapter question to you guys is, how do you guys feel about Gojo's death? Let me know your biggest hot take down in the comment section below.